Well, good morning, everyone. I just came from the floor of the Senate, where one of those days that kind of makes your head explode. I've worked with the two senators from North Carolina to come up with a bipartisan bill that would try to deal with some of the hurt that's taken place across our country from Hurricane Helene. Before we broke for the elections, frankly, the Small Business Administration didn't do a good enough job of predicting how much money they'd need to make sure that SBA loans could be continued during this disaster after the hurricane. Well, since October 15th, I think 34,000 businesses have applied across the country, not just Virginia, have applied for SBA loans, only to get a notice back that, we'll give you the loan, you've been approved, once Congress refills the pot. We do this all of the time, and we do it in a way that's, in Washington speak, is technically not paid for because you don't know how big the disaster is. Well, today, Thom Tillis and I had bipartisan legislation that would refill that bucket and make sure that folks in Southwest Virginia who are waiting for those SBA loans, I think about particularly Damascus, a little town that entirely depends on tourism from the Creeper Trail. Those businesses don't get these loans, they're going to close up shop, and that town is going to hit really hard times. This isn't charity. This is your right as a taxpayer to count on these programs, whether it's FEMA or SBA, in the midst of a disaster. We asked for unanimous consent, and one grandstanding senator stood up and objected. So getting those folks the money they have qualified for is going to take a bit longer. And I don't know how you go back and say to a business, we had a chance to do this quick today in the Senate. It didn't get done. Pretty darn frustrating. We've got a fairly full plate in the end of the so-called lame duck session. There's still a debate. I think it'll probably be kicked over in terms of the full funding for the rest of the government year. And each time we do one of these so-called continuing resolutions, it's bad policy, bad business, and a state like Virginia gets particularly hard hit because if you do a continuing resolution, even though we're 4 months into this fiscal year, you can't start the new programs that have already been budgeted or appropriated because the overall budget hasn't passed. And particularly when we think about in Virginia continuing resolutions, which if it gets kicked over for another couple of months, means that if a ship got repaired with last year's fiscal money, you can't go ahead and start on the next ship because the continuing resolution says you got to use the last year numbers. We keep it flat. Crazy way to operate. But it appears that the Republican House is going to say, no, let's just push this off in the next year. In the interim, though, we've still got to do the National Defense Bill, which is terribly important. We have to do the Intel authorization, and we need to have the bigger fight. I hope, because I talked a little bit about storm relief with the SBA, the bigger pot is FEMA, and there will be billions and billions of dollars. I mean, some people have assumed North Carolina alone might be asking for up to just $50 billion. In Virginia, I'm working closely with the governor in terms of getting our whole assessment down. It's going to be a bit of an eye-popping number, I think, when we get it over the next week or so. But historically, Congress comes together in a bipartisan way and gets that done. It would be a real shame if we didn't do our job and get that done before we broke for the holidays. I mean, I don't know how you go back to tell small businesses in Southwest Virginia or families that deserve additional FEMA aid or the farms that need that USDA ag support that comes after disasters that it just wasn't convenient to get it done. In terms of the other news of the week, obviously, is some of the Trump appointments. Yesterday was more than a little surprising on some of the names that have been floated forward. and I know most of you know, but there is a reason that we have a Senate confirmation process. It allows candidates, the President-elect Trump won the race. He's got a right to put forward his candidates. They have a right to be considered. But when you have that advise and consent process, a candidate gets to be vetted in terms of their background. We get to see, as the American citizens, because all of the hearings on these nominees are public. And I can tell you, as chairman of the Intelligence Committee, we live in a very, very dangerous time. And you've got Russia and Ukraine. You've got Russia's aspirations in terms of maybe further expansion. You've got their intervention in spreading misinformation around our election time. As I've talked many times before about the rise of China and our technology threats. The administration came forward a little bit more on this Salt Typhoon penetration. I'm going to continue to push them to even declassify more information. This will be, I believe, the worst hack in modern American history. We've got enormous challenges, both international and domestic. So the jobs of Attorney General or Director of National Intelligence or Secretary of Defense, the biggest management job in America, the Pentagon workforce is bigger than Walmart, are serious jobs and require serious people. And there have been some, I've already indicated, Marco Rubio, who I've worked closely with over the last 10 years plus on the Intel Committee. Most recently, he's been the vice chairman. I don't agree with Marco on a whole lot of issues, but he does bring a level of seriousness to the important job of Secretary of State. There have been a few others that I think fall in that category. But there's some that we need that vetting process, and any attempt to drop names that couldn't get through a vetting process or couldn't get through an open hearing in some form of recess approach would be totally counter to the way that our system works. Two last comments. One is a little piece of good news for turkey growers in Virginia, and obviously we've got a big turkey industry in the Shenandoah Valley, a bit of more chicken than turkey, but on the Eastern Shore. And poultry we're the 6th largest poultry state in the country. We have been fighting for some time to get the markets of India and Turkey, the country Turkey, open. That has now taken place, and that's good for the growers. And then finally, I think November 23rd, we're having our 12th annual Women's Conference in Roanoke. This is an area for free conference. It'll be at the Hotel Roanoke, I believe, again this year. We do it around the state. It's where women leaders, women business leaders, we have a whole day of programming from lifestyle to business development, and a great chance to network. It's something I'm very proud of, and again, it's free, and we welcome women all across the Commonwealth. This year we'll probably get disproportionately from Southwest Virginia, but I hope folks will be able to attend. With that, why don't I turn it over to Laura and be happy to start taking your questions.
Senator, our first question will be Mark Fisher with Washington Post.
Good morning, Senator. You spoke yesterday about the coming attack on federal workers by the Trump administration and the likelihood that there'll be efforts to really cut back on the number. What specific tools does Congress have to try to either slow or block those kinds of wholesale eliminations of sections, bureaus, departments, and so on?
The president doesn't have the arbitrary power to shut down departments. This is the Congress has to pass that kind of legislation. My hope is that we will act responsibly. If there's ways to bring more efficiency to government, count me in. When I was governor, Virginia was named independently the best managed state. But Business 101 says there is value in having, adjacency of departments in the federal government. I can tell you from the intelligence standpoint, having the CIA, the NGA, the NRO, the Director of National Intelligence, the NSA over the river in Maryland, the value of having those intelligence professionals be able to get close to each other and go back and forth is enormous. Anybody that makes a case otherwise of trying to split this up and around doesn't make that doesn't pass Business 101. In terms of numbers, arbitrarily taking a hack to the government workforce, which will simply mean in many cases will just supplement that same purpose as well with contractors, ends up costing more money. So, I know the delegation is united. I've asked the business community, as you know, Mark, to help us make the case for our region that willy-nilly, arbitrary hacking at government isn't going to be efficient, isn't going to be effective, and we will fight back with every tool we've got. And I would point out I saw a posting yesterday from someone that was supposedly in the Trump orbit. It was not an official, saying, well, we ought to just go ahead and arbitrarily pick by Social Security number, whether you're an even number or odd number, I think it was, and just eliminate workers that way. I mean, that kind of approach and this arbitrariness, or the notion we're going to suddenly take $2 trillion out of our government spend, shows a disconnection from the reality. If you're not also willing to tell the American people which government services are you no longer going to provide.
Senator, we're going to go to Mitchell Miller with WTOP.
Hi, Senator. Thanks for joining us. And apologies if I'm following up on something you already stated. I was on with your colleague, Senator Kaine, just a moment ago. But can you tell us a little bit more about your thoughts on President-elect Trump's choice of Tulsi Gabbard as head of the DNI, and then more broadly about this push for Senate Republicans to push for recess appointments and your thoughts on that?
Well, I know former Congresswoman Gabbard. There have been lots of reports about some of her ties to countries that are very unfriendly to the United States. That's why we do, particularly for this role, there's a background investigation. That's what is done with every nominee, whether you're a Democratic president or Republican president. I think there needs to be a thorough vetting. I've got a lot of questions about Ms. Gabbard, but that's why we have an advise and consent process. That's why we have these hearings, even for the Director of National Intelligence. At least most of it is done in the public. And some of these claims of her ties to adversaries like Russia and Syria, there's got to be both knowledge and explanation of that. And I have grave reservations, but I'm going to, again, give the President-elect, we'll go through that process. And I'll be, at that point, the vice chair of the committee, but one of the things that I've been very proud of, whether I've been vice chair or chair, is I believe the Intel Committee is the last fully functioning bipartisan committee. We take our roles very responsibly, and I'll expect that to continue for the committee. And in terms of the recess appointments, I will simply take all of what my Republican colleagues said about recess appointments back in 2000, I believe 12, when President Obama tried to, on a couple, to do that. I hope they will live by those same concerns they had back then. And these are extraordinarily serious jobs. The idea that you're going to put people that potentially are unqualified or unable to get a majority, even with a Republican Senate, and somehow drop them in these most important, serious jobs that we have in our federal government, would be irresponsible.
Senator, we're going to move to Rachel Branning with WSET.
Hi, Senator Warner. Thank you for doing this. I know you have touched on this kind of a lot right now. I know you had said that the pick for Attorney General isn't necessarily a serious pick, and Senator Kaine kind of mimicked that same sentiment. Are there any other picks that you're particularly concerned about?
Again, I don't know, Mr. Gates. I would be curious to see whether he could get even a majority of the House Republicans who've actually known and worked with him for years. And I think you've seen kind of the word that we all had was wow when that was announced. again, I'm not going to weigh in on these on an individual basis as they get named. There is an advise and consent. We got to have hearings. They got to be open. I was a governor. I made appointments. The chief executive gets to make appointments, but then the Senate gets to advise and consent. That's in the Constitution. Unless we're starting to throw out the Constitution, I hope the president-elect adheres to that.
Senator, our next question is Brendan Potton with WTKR.
Hey, Senator. I mean, you might have already addressed this then, but just on Defense Secretary, did you have any thoughts on that one? And Pete Hegseth, and just comments he's made saying he doesn't think women should serve in combat roles.
So I'm not going to get into his individual statements at this point. I respect his service. He was a decorated veteran, and I respect his service. But just from the plain management standpoint, somebody said it was a good comment. Would you have this gentleman, would you turn over the reins of the whole corporation of Walmart over to him? Because that's the kind of management challenge you got that lies ahead of him. I think at this moment in time, when we have so many challenges to our national security, where our Defense Department needs to be at its best, we've got to have individuals who've got the experience, the know-how, the ability to show, to work candidly with both the civilian defense workforce and the military defense workforce. And I think that individual has got a tough road to hoe to make the case that he's got those qualifications.
Senator, our next question is Kate Nuderlein with 29 News.
Hi, Senator Warner. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. You already touched on this a bit, so feel free to be as brief as you want to. But regarding the Attorney General pick, if it is Gates or someone similar, we spoke in brief last week about the threats to the federal workforce, which is particularly dangerous in Virginia. And just regarding those comments from Gates about potentially abolishing three-letter agencies such as the FBI or DOJ, kind of what are your thoughts on an attorney general such as Gates or someone similar? Do you think that is a real threat, or do you think that there would be too many challenges for actual change like that to be made?
My head's spinning, and I don't know very many responsible leaders of either political party that thinks that we would be safer, more secure from both domestic crime or international violations by getting rid of the FBI, or the idea that we should get rid of the government's ability to, for example, what the Department of Justice does is respond to lawsuits. So I know what I've heard from Mr. Gates is he is very unfriendly to things like environmental protections. Well, when somebody sues the government, who defends the government against something that he might even view as an overreach? It's the Department of Justice. To kind of make those comments, in my mind, shows I don't think he understands the basic functions of this department. So again, let's see how this vetting and process goes through. But what I am concerned about is that by throwing out unserious individuals for some positions, that he's going to put such a fear in the government workforce that the most talented in our workforce, the folks who've got the most expertise, may decide it's time to hang up, retire, leave. And if we were going to suddenly then say all of those functions we're going to get rid of, I wouldn't agree with that. But if we don't get rid of those functions, they're going to have to be replaced. We're not going to provide that level of service. There are ways to bring efficiency, and I did that when I was governor of Virginia. Count me in. But to take a hacksaw without much thought to our federal workforce would not save us money. It would have literally much longer implications to the operations of the federal government beyond this current president-elect's term. And it would be devastating, not only to the greater capital region, but to the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Senator, our next question is Raquel with Nexstar.
Okay, sorry about that. I had some issues. It was a two-parter. Just wanted to get clarity on how much longer you think it's going to take for Congress to refill the disaster relief program for small businesses. And then also your thoughts. Are you concerned about the Trump administration potentially halting the sale of...
The sale of, pardon me?
Of TikTok.
Oh, okay. First, we had a chance to pass it from the Senate today unanimously. 99 senators agreed that this bill should put politics aside, and those businesses in Southwest Virginia and all across the country got hit by hurricanes. Those businesses have been approved by the SBA, ought to get their check. One guy stood up and objected. 99 others, we had something called a hotline, they all approved. So I'm going to keep pushing to get that on the floor, have that vote. It would be a lot faster, obviously, to do it the way I suggested. It's still going to have to go through the House. And what I'm really concerned about as well is when we think about the larger amount of dollars, the FEMA disaster relief, the ability to rebuild 58 in Southwest Virginia. I mean, there's parts of interstates in North Carolina that are just gone. Are we going to drag that out as well, or say we got to wait to the next administration to do that? It would be irresponsibility on steroids. And the remarkable thing, at least in terms of Southwest Virginia, is that this region overwhelmingly voted for the president-elect. What kind of backhand signal is that when his allies are some of the people trying to stop these resources going? On the question of TikTok, I mean, the guy who first pointed out the danger with TikTok was Donald Trump when he was president the first time. And I've said this repeatedly. Didn't hear me say, on that issue, he was right. The ability for TikTok to collect American user information and potentially be a mouthpiece or propaganda machine for the Communist Party of China. Those dangers haven't gone away. Matter of fact, 80% of the House and the Senate voted not to force get rid of TikTok or a ban on TikTok. It's not a ban. It's just saying TikTok's got a lot of creativity. Let's have it owned and controlled not by a Chinese company, which by Chinese law is answerable to the Communist Party of China. If the only reason he's changing this position is because of financial support from a big investor, and roughly 40% of the TikTok's ownership is by American investors, then awful lot of explaining to do. And I sure as heck hope that the 80% of us who came to agreement on TikTok, that people are not going to get weak-kneed.
Senator, we're going to move on to Pim Kia-Trungrit with CBS 19.
Hi, Senator Warner. Thank you so much for doing this. I just had a question to see how you felt about a potential government shutdown in the near future.
Well, we avoided one right before the election, and obviously the longest one in our history was under President Trump. It appears that the margin in the House is going to be very small, where the so-called Freedom Caucus put us on a shutdown again. I hope not. I'm not sure why we won't go ahead and do our job and finish government funding for this year. Remember, government funding for this fiscal year starts October 1. It goes October 1 to September 30th. So by the time Christmas comes around, we're already going to be 3 months in. I hope and pray that there's not going to be a shutdown. Again, in Virginia, we take it harder because of so much military, government work, contractor work. Think about the parks. We've done a lot for the Shenandoah National Park in terms of our Restore American Parks Act and other parks around Virginia. All that gets put in jeopardy during shutdowns. So, and depending on how long, how extensive, it'd be a disaster. But I don't have a good prediction.
We're going to move on to Adam Tuss with NBC4.
Hey, good morning, Senator. Thanks for doing this. Piggybacking off the federal workers comment, been some comments specifically in D.C. among leaders that the incoming administration is going to call all federal workers back to the office, regardless of the cuts that were being talked about. Just curious your thoughts on all federal workers returning to the office, whether or not that's a good thing, and then specifically for an agency like Metro, whether or not that's a positive.
Well, I think we've seen some progress on Metro, and I was at a regional transportation conference yesterday. It's going to be even harder for us to work in a bipartisan way again to keep getting that $150 million a year for operations. And, I want to try to make the case again, because of the unique nature of the National Capital Region, that we've got national security issues that other communities in America don't have, and there ought to be a little bit of plus up there as well. I've advocated for a long time that workforce, public sector, private sector ought to be back in the office. That doesn't necessarily mean, 5 days, but it does mean a lot more than we've got right now. And, because candidly, if there are departments that are only in a day a week, then the ability to say, well, there's value in having them adjacent to each other and combined goes down dramatically. If you can say, well, we can take this part of agriculture department and put it in somewhere in the Midwest or in the West. So I think it is in all workers, public sector and private sector's best interest, as much as possible, get back to in work in the office. I've had that, I've had that rule in my office literally almost probably earlier than some of my staff like, but I felt like I worked for 8.5 million Virginians, many of whom, even during the midst of the pandemic, didn't have the option to work remotely. And I think from an efficiency standpoint, and frankly particularly for younger people, ability to collaborate and learn, a lot better is done together. Now, can there be some exceptions? Can there be some flexibility? Yes, but I just fear that I've been pressing the administration for the last year plus. I wish we were further down this process.
Next up is Charlie Pollen with Virginia Mercury.
Hey, Senator. Thanks for doing this. Quick question on Chapter 12 of Project 2025, which calls for overhauls to the U.S. Department of Energy and repealing the BIL and IRA, which could provide funding for small modular reactors. Any thoughts about that plan going forward, and more broadly, Trump's approach to energy, which could stifle offshore wind, which is a big deal in Virginia?
Yeah, I got a bunch of comments. One, if we're going to be able to power our economy, especially if you care about carbon emissions and the changing climate, solar and wind are important, batteries important, but we're going to have to bring back nuclear power. And I'm working very closely with the governor on that. We had a recent announcement with Amazon about a big step forward with Dominion. And this is a national security issue. It's good for powering America carbon free, but it's also, we are in competition with China and Russia. China's building 30 reactors currently, and they're going to go up to 50 reactors at a time being built. If other countries end up becoming dependent upon Chinese or Russian nuclear reactors, just as we were so long dependent upon Middle East oil, that is not good for America. We've got to build and operate small modular nuclear. It's important for energy, it's important for national security, and it would be the height of irresponsibility. Well, just one more example coming out of that Project 2025 book. The IRA, I mean, again, one of the things I think you've got to give the Biden administration credit on is the IRA funding in terms of whether it's battery technology or whether it is solar panels. Most of that has gone to states that voted, in many cases, overwhelmingly for President Trump. You're going to shut down those manufacturing facilities? And then finally, on offshore wind, Virginia will have the largest offshore wind operation on the East Coast. Wind has gone up and down a little bit over the last couple of years, but it is a clean and sustainable, and ultimately, if we get to scale, I believe affordable. And because Virginia is the lead in this, as we think about the manufacturing components that go into offshore wind, we can be the country's leader. It's going to be ironic, I think, whether it is on any of these issues. Elon Musk, who I know is quite close to the president, at least at this point, he depends on a lot of those government subsidies to have his Tesla operations. There's lots of other resources that have gone into offshore wind and obviously into nuclear. Not having a mixed energy commitment that would include these carbon-free, I think would be a mistake. And I even heard that the current CEO of Exxon, the world's largest oil producer, has said that he thinks all of this diversification of our energy system, now it would be all of the above, is important, and that somehow to withdraw this movement, it would be not good for the planet, but it also would not be good for American business over the long haul, because this is where the future of energy in the world is headed. And we need to have American competitors and American players in that sector.
Our next question is Joe Thomas with Joe in the Morning. Joe? Okay, we're going to move on to our final question. Amy Knowles with the Virginia Dogwood.
Hey, Senator Warner, thanks for taking our questions. The comeback city's done it again. There was an announcement made in the Danville area that a lithium-ion battery plant is coming to town. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that and what you hope it'll mean for the area.
I know that announcement was yesterday. I'm proud of the fact that we worked with Elysium as well. I think it's great news, not just for Danville, but for all of Southside. I know it doesn't take all of the land at the mega site at Berry Plain, I believe, Berry Farm. But it's a huge positive affirmation of Danville as the comeback city, but also that the future for Southside Virginia is going to be bright. And I was proud to work with the governor on that. And there are both state incentives and some federal incentives on that project. So chalk up another win for Southside.
That was our final question.
Everybody, be safe.